All right. Sorry about that. I know the video went twice.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Video went twice.
Okay. There we go. I at least can hear you coming through.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. I think we're good now. A little technical difficulty.
Got it. Good.
All right. Hello, everybody. Let me just get a couple comments in here. Who's in the chat? Hey. All right. So as you all come in, go ahead and say hey. And as always, feel free to put any comments, questions in the chat. I think most of you already know my guest. If you don't, I'm going to let him do a brief introduction. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. Make sure you hit that bell. Make sure you, get notified every time we go live. I'm trying to get guests that I think can really add something to our understanding so that we can just be better men and women of God, better parents, better leaders, and better defenders of the faith in general. So with that being said, Sean McDowell is my guest today. I'm so happy to, and I have a story I'm going to tell on myself in a second. So just wait a second. But before I do that, go ahead and let everybody know who you are, what you do, and kind of the background of how you got into apologetics.
Sure. So I teach at Biola University, specifically Talbot School of Theology, classes on apologetics, resurrection, problem of evil, Christian sexual ethics, etc. Teach high school part-time at a private school. I had a class this morning. I just jetted over here from and get to speak. Yeah, no, happy to do it. I'm glad it worked. And I get to speak and write as well. Plus a dad of 3 kids keeps me busy. And the story of getting into apologetics, that's a pretty long story, but a lot of it was my own questions that I went through, my desire to work with young people and help them through the questions that I wrestled through. And of course, my family, just having a dad who was and still is an apologist, certainly rubbed off on me, his enthusiasm and approach to that in his life and ministry.
And for those that don't know, your dad is
Josh McDowell,
which I think most people are well aware of, but so I appreciate that. And the connection, are you still a youth pastor or do you still?
No, I did that 1 year, years ago. So I just at a private Christian school is the youth focus plus speaking.
Gotcha. So that's a lot of my focus as well. So I definitely want to get into that. I know a lot of people in here, our parents have children and some I've talked to personally and just trying to help their teenager navigate these spaces. So we'll get into all that. But let me start like this. It was some humble pie. I met Sean, was it about 5 years ago? So there's most people have heard of Frank Turek and Jim Warner Wallace and these people, Greg Kokel. And there's a organization that Frank has called Cross-Examine Instructors Academy. So I was privileged enough to go out there and train out in California. And this was right when I was just starting to get into apologetics. And actually, I had just finished I Don't Have Enough Faith like the week before I got there. I had read some other things like A Case for Christ and those books, but we have to prepare 2 presentations. So for those that don't know, this isn't just a conference where you go and listen to all the experts talk at you and then you go home. No, you have to come there, prepare with prepared presentations and present in front of these world-class apologists, which is nerve-wracking enough. And they critique you. And if anybody's, first of all, scared of that, don't be. I'd rather fail in public, which I did. I mean, in private rather than fail in public. And so I used to, at my former church, I was a pastor of education. I trained, but I led a ministry education department that trained almost 200 ministers. And we had an evaluation process, but I started all that because it didn't exist. And some people were always nervous about the evaluation. So I would let them know, look, I've been evaluated, I have failed, and I'm better because of it. And so here's the story. So first, Sean, what did you do your dissertation on? This will help.
The deaths of the apostles. What really happened to them, given some of the martyrdom stories we hear about Peter, Paul, James, John, etc.
Right. So I come in very confident with my first presentation. Sean is my evaluator, and I essentially use the fate of the apostles to prove the resurrection or something to that effect. But I didn't know that that was literally like, he's the expert probably in the world on this specific topic. And I got some things wrong. And it was funny because I think a lot of people in our little group knew who you were more than I did at that time. And so that was my first presentation. So if anybody's ever felt like, you didn't get it right, or you failed in ministry, or you didn't say it right, trust me, I've been there and I'm better for it.
Hey, I'm just glad you're still doing apologetics, because I was like, I want to encourage them in this world. I want to discourage them too much and be too negative, but I'm going to push back on a couple things here. So kudos for you for taking it and just, going forward and just keep getting better and improving your ministry. So way to go.
Thank you. And it led to me. I came back a couple of more times with you all. And then I finished up my master's in apologetics last year, and considering PhD work, I don't know yet, but cool. It was definitely something that kind of sparked something in me, that just kind of the way my brain works, I guess. I'm just very logical. And so I was already, saved and understood the basics. But when I read the Case for Christ, I didn't know what apologetics were. I had never heard the word. And it never occurred to me to even look for or think about external evidence. But when he was Lee Strobel was laying some stuff out, it was just feeding me in a way that I had never really experienced. I'm not hyper, I guess, charismatic or whatever you want to call it. And so I'm a thinker. And so when I got an understanding of apologetics, it hit me in a different way. And so what I want to start with is, now that I've told on myself and you kind of outlined who you are and your focus and what everybody should know you for, because it's really important that we get clarity. So how does the fate of the original disciples and apostles, what does that tell us about the truth of Christianity in general?
So sometimes this argument is made, like the apostles all died as martyrs, refusing to recant their faith. Therefore, the resurrection happened and Christianity is true. That's how this argument is sometimes made, but that's not, I don't think it's accurate. In fact, I know it's not accurate, because this doesn't prove that Christianity is true. It doesn't prove the resurrection happened. What it does is it's a small piece, but a significant piece that helps establish their sincerity and belief that they had really seen Jesus alive after the grave. So it's a part of a larger case for the resurrection. And I think what it does is, we know early on the apostles say we saw Jesus. All the counts from 1 Corinthians 15, from the book of Acts, from the Gospels, is that they had appearances of the risen Jesus. They intentionally put themselves in harm's way to preach that message. In other words, they're willing to put their lives and well-being on the line for their conviction that they had seen Jesus risen from the grave. Well, we know that if you read the book of Acts, they're thrown in prison, they're beaten, they're threatened. We have Stephen killed in the early chapters in Acts, and then James, the son of Zebedee, killed in Acts 12. Right. Well, this doesn't sound like a group of liars that are inventing a story to intentionally get themselves to suffer and experience pain. So it doesn't disprove the hallucination hypothesis. What it does show is they're not liars and they're not inventing a story. They at least minimally thought they had seen the risen Jesus and are willing to suffer for it. So I think that's what it helps establish. So we got to be careful to not overstate it, but I also don't want to understate it, because today people think if you just send out a tweet, like that's standing for a belief, but people aren't willing to suffer for something. Rarely. They were willing to put their lives on the line for this belief.
Right. Right. And so I just finished a video. It actually, it's going to drop tomorrow evening, everybody, I think 8:30 Central. And it's dealing with why we know we can trust the words of Jesus. And part of and it's obviously it's never going to be exhaustive doing a YouTube video, but I'm just trying to give people snippets and just looking at, there's something called ipsissima vox and ipsissima verba, the very words of the very voice. So looking at putting all the pieces together, kind of like you and Jim talk a lot about that, we're never going to make the total case off one part of the puzzle. But when you put all the parts together in kind of a abductive approach, it's very hard to say all of this is wrong, you know? And that's when I talk with atheists, that's kind of the point. It's like, well, okay, this is not the convincer for you, but what about all of this together? And so I think as you have kind of outlined, like, even if we don't know how every single disciple died, like with video evidence, we know enough about how enough of them died that it's really hard to discount that they fully believed it, whether we believe it or not, or whether somebody believes it or not. And so one of my mentors always says that what the Bible doesn't say is just as important as what it does say. And so we don't have record, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have record pertaining to any of the initial disciples recanting, right? And that's what we would expect. And that would be probably what some atheists would consider a defeater to Christianity if we had that type of information. But in your research, what extra biblical evidence do you find that supports the view that the initial disciples, at least the ones we have record of, were committed to the truth from beginning to end?
So we don't have a record of them being willing to any record of any of the apostles recanting. But we have to be careful what we conclude from this, because in one sense that is an argument from silence. We're lacking something. So as you said, would we expect to have it? Well, I think you can make a good case that we would, because in one sense, if there were any, so there's a debate in the early church about what happens to Christians who in the moment of being martyred recant their faith and then want to come back to the faith. There's debates about this in some of the early centuries. So if there were any stories about an apostle doing this, even apocryphal stories, you better believe somebody would have said, well, what about Thaddeus? What about, James, son of Alphaeus? What about Matthew? But there's no account from some believers who might have had incentive. There's also no account from critics, people like Celsus, who Origen responds to in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These critics could have dismantled their testimony by sharing stories of even alleged recantation of faith, and they don't. So I want to be careful not to overstate this, because technically it's an argument from silence, but I say it's an argument of silence with some teeth, because there's good reason to believe we would find it from enemies and from friends if such a recantation had happened.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think in general, in apologetics, we have to be careful not to overstate our cases.
Amen.
And here's the thing. We don't need to. Like there's more evidence historically, archaeologically even. Do you know Ted Wright? I don't know.
I don't know him well, but I know Ted. Yeah.
So he's an archaeologist, and had him on a month or two ago. And
great.
It's hard when you're holding something in your hand, it's tangible, and you could say like, no, this is the actual thing. So there's some stuff that we simply can't deny. And once again, we put it all together. We really don't need to overstate our case. I think sometimes people do that out of fear, that maybe in the back of their mind, maybe they're struggling with the truth of this. But as far as historical events or beliefs or systems are concerned, we have more to work with than almost any other historical belief or system or occurrence. And even when we think about the resurrection, it's hard to look at everything that happened after that and not believe that it happened, unless you have a presupposition against the miraculous. So yeah, just a quick side note to everybody: don't feel the need to overstate your case. Simply state your case, and let people wrestle with it however they wrestle with it. It's not on us. Ultimately, it's going to be the Holy Spirit that changes the heart anyway, right?
Amen.
So let me shift gears in a large way. But I wanted to get that out there because you being the expert on this topic, I wanted everybody to hear from you how we should properly think about what happened to the disciples in the early church. But I do want to shift gears because I know you do a lot of work on culture and marriage and sex and how to properly understand all these things. Before I jump into that, I remember you told me a story, or you told all of us a story. You were at an event or a conference, and either you didn't know it was kind of was it LGBT? Well, I'm not sure exactly, but you asked them kind of about tolerance and if they would reciprocate. Can you kind of tell us that story? Because I think it's a really good window into how to do this well.
Yeah, sure. This was 2014, if I remember correctly. And the Obergefell same-sex marriage Supreme Court ruling was 2015. So it was when there was all this cultural discussion about the LGB, not so much the T, and how the church was going to respond. So I went to this national conference that was intent on reforming the church from within, getting Christians to adopt what is called an affirming view on same-sex relationships, that God is fine with same-sex relationships, but the biblical account is just against, say, master-slave or pederasty, an adult and a child, but would be fine with the monogamous, loving, mutual same-sex unions we see today. That's the argument. Yeah. Well, I went, and there were some lengthy sessions on challenging the typical arguments that a lot of Christians in the church have heard about God's view on sexuality. So first off, I was like, wow, these are, I don't buy them, but these are sophisticated, thoughtful arguments. But then after hearing this 90-minute lecture, they had given us name tags. They said, flip over your name tag because we have assigned each of you to go to a room because now you're going to go role play and practice these. So when you go home, you can have conversations with family, with neighbors, with coworkers, with people that you go to church with, and help talk them out of their historic Christian views on sexuality. That was the purpose of this. Well, we go in a room and we sit down in 2 rows of chairs kind of shaped like a U facing the front. And the lady goes to the whiteboard. If I remember, there were maybe 15, 20 of us. And she says, we're going to role play like they want us to. But first, if we go around the room, it'd be great if everyone would introduce yourself and share why you're here and why you're so passionate about this movement. I was sitting there thinking, wow, I'm getting called out, so to speak. I'm the only one here who doesn't hold the view that all these other people at this conference hold. I wonder how this is going to go down. So fortunately, I was like 12 or 15 people into it. So I had time to pray and think about a good response. Yeah. And when it was my time, I stood up because that's what everyone was doing. I just said, hey, my name's Sean McDowell. I teach at Biola University, which a lot of people there kind of turned and looked at me and were like, huh, that's interesting because Biola is a historic Christian inerrantist conservative Bible school with that reputation. Holds a historic view of marriage. I said, I think exactly what I said, some effect of, look, that means I'm probably not theologically where you want me to be. But let me read you something. I had this packet that they gave out to everyone who came to the conference, and it was like a worship packet and vendors, etc. And the front of it, as best I can remember, said something like, you are welcome here. No matter where you've been on your journey, no matter where you're going, you are loved and you're accepted here. I read it to him. I said, even though I disagree with what's being taught at this conference, does this apply to me? And they had to say yes because I signed up for the conference and it was on their very, document that they passed out. People were very kind and they were very cordial. And I did feel like they welcomed me in, but it was kind of a plea that was saying, wait a minute, do you really believe in tolerance? Do you really believe in acceptance? Or is it you have to think like I do and you're not accepted, which would be ironic because that's their very critique of the church. Yeah.
No, that was so good. And I think that thankfully you had time to pray and God could give you the directions on that.
But I needed
it. Well, it's interesting because a lot of times I feel like the last year, like a broken record, talking about tolerance and how to properly understand it and telling people that, like if Sean, if you say, I like basketball, and then I say, hey, I like basketball too, I'm not tolerating your position. I'm agreeing with you.
That's right.
A necessary prerequisite for tolerance is disagreement. And so this is not even like a theological issue. This is a grammar issue. This is just people don't understand the English language to some degree, that the word does not mean what they think it means. And so that you pointed that out in a very in a great way, because they, like you said, they had to say it. They had to align with what they stated as their mission or vision. And so for us, as for those who are apologists, knowing how to kind of push back on the narratives that are, being hammered home through the media or through social media, which is the worst, at us, let's understand that a lot of times people just need clarification on what we're saying and what we're not saying, and the logical inconsistency of what they're saying at times, if it is that way. And so that way you you can kind of take the fight down a notch before it even really gets started. Okay, so with that being said, the way I wanted to shift was talking about like God's views on marriage and why he has the view he has. And obviously God being omniscient, we don't really have to determine or agree with why he feels the way he does. We just have to come to understand it. So I co-pastor a house church, and we're right now working through Romans. And so was it last week I was teaching that second half of Romans 1, and before we get to those last few verses with the 23 sins, there's that other part, right? And I took about 45 minutes to give a robust, like theologically sound, not just this is why it is this way, why God feels this way, how Jesus reaffirmed it. This is how we can engage in conversation. Because I think the church, big church, we don't do a great teaching all the time. I know some churches do. I'm not trying to bash anyone, but I think there's a lot of times where people are on this side, just like burn them all, send them to hell. And on this side, it's affirm. And you're both wrong. So first, let's start like this. Let's clarify God's view on marriage and why is it that way?
Okay, so those are two separate questions that overlap. The first one, what is God's view of marriage? The place to go is back to Genesis 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. Genesis 1 says God made them male and made them female. We are sexed beings. God could have made us with 3 sexes. He could have made us asexual. But part of being human is that we are sexed beings. So interestingly enough, our skin color is secondary to our identity. Our level of intelligence is secondary to our identity. Our socioeconomic status. Those things can change. You or I could get a tan or lose a tan. It wouldn't change essentially who we are. But something that's essential to us is our sex. God made us as sexed beings. That's Genesis 1. It says populate, fill the earth. How do we do that? Genesis chapter 2. Man leaves his father and mother. So it's not his father and mothers. That's not God's original design. It wasn't a father and a father. God's intention for the household was one father and one mother. The man leaves, clings to his wife. So we know he's talking about marriage. And then they will create their own household who will have kids who will leave and cleave with their spouses and fulfill the earth as is commanded in Genesis chapter 1. That's the clear pattern that's set up in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, if you go to Jesus, what's interesting is in Matthew 19, Jesus is asked about divorce. He points back and quotes Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24. He says to the Pharisees, have you not read? Meaning he's pointing to this, what was written down, in this case, Genesis 1 and 2, as being normative for how we answer the question about the nature of marriage and divorce today, at least in Jesus's day, so to speak. And what does he do? He affirms that it's a sexed institution that is meant to procreate and fill the earth. Now, of course, everybody in the Bible doesn't follow that pattern for marriage. That's pretty obvious. We have to be careful not to confuse what the Bible describes with what the Bible prescribes. So the Bible describes David's sin and Solomon's and their failure to live up to his pattern for marriage. But God still uses them, and Jesus affirmed the way it was at the beginning is the way that it's supposed to be today. Now, the deeper purpose of marriage is not for companionship. It's not for happiness. It's not for procreation. The deepest mystery of marriage, Paul says in Ephesians 5:31 and 32, is to mirror, so to speak, the mystery of Christ's love for the church.
Mm-hmm.
So the Bible begins with a wedding, with a marriage, and it ends with a wedding, with a marriage, but of a different kind.
Right.
So marriage is one man, one woman who become one flesh for one lifetime. And that is a mystery pointing towards God's love for the church and our ultimate union with him and with other people in heaven for eternity.
Well said. Well said. I think, and I use that same Matthew 19 passage that you did, because what's interesting when I hear some people, especially when it happens in the church, some people say, well, Jesus doesn't explicitly, at least we don't have record of him explicitly denying, homosexuality or this or that. But see, that creates a problem if you want to be faithful to Scripture. Now, if you don't care, then that's fine for you. But if you're going to be faithful to Scripture, you can't really say that, because now you've bifurcated God. And if God is a Trinity, you can't have Jesus disagreeing with God the Father. And so, like you said, the fact that he's affirming what was said in Genesis 1 and 2 is him co-signing essentially the total perspective of the Godhead. And so that argument fails mostly on a logical level, that you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You can't take all the stuff you like from Jesus and then take all the stuff you don't like. Or, I would say, well, Jesus never said don't smoke crack. Do you think that's a good, like, where does it stop? There's a lot of things that don't have to be explicit in that way. And I also thought, as you said, and I've said this before, so when God gives that mandate, there is no father and mother to leave. Like this gives me even more reason to believe that God is giving a prescription, as you said, for how things should be going forward. Because when Adam and Eve are there is no father and mother to leave. Yet he gives the command anyway in that way. And so it's setting up pretty clearly that this is the mandate for how humanity will and should flourish. And that's not just pertaining to Adam and Eve, it's pertaining to every generation going forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a pattern, and Jesus affirms that it's meant to be that way through all of time. That's what marriage is, which is why it's so important that we get a biblical understanding of marriage and live it out within the church.
Amen. So with that, like I said, I've been a youth pastor, formerly a youth pastor for years. I still do a lot with youth, and most of, at least when I'm able to speak live, whenever that happens again, a lot of stuff I direct towards youth and young adults. So teens and young adults. And I see, and I'm sure you see, that's the greatest, risk zone in life. My kids are 6 and 9, but even with my oldest, I started teaching her apologetics when she was 6 or 7. Because everything is happening younger now. So what you and I were exposed to in college is high school now, and high school is elementary, and my kids go to public school. And so for me, it's a mindset of trying to preempt, and it's a great school, I don't want to knock it, but I do want to preempt certain things that might be taught. And that's led to some of the conversations I've had with her. But it frustrates me too, because I'm like, she's 7. Like, let the kid be a kid. Kids don't get to be kids anymore. I don't want to have these conversations, but I'm not going to let them have it first, and as her father. So I got to do what I got to do, but it just kind of sucks the way the world has gone in pushing things on our young people, that they're not thinking one way or the other on any of these issues a lot of the times until we bring them up, or until they're brought up in school. And so with that, we know kind of the 65 to 7% of youth walk away, and we hear the statistics, and I like to kind of say there's 2 S's, the big S's, either sex or science, right? Let's deal with each of those kind of separately. Sometimes they get to college and then they're unprepared because they didn't have, Sean McDowell in their high school, or maybe their youth pastor wasn't equipped to kind of give them a robust understanding. And in the last few months, I've had Dr. Hugh Ross, Fazal Rana, Michael Strauss. These are scientists at the epitome of their fields, and specifically because there was this has happened several times. There was a pastor who reached out to me a couple weeks ago, a pastor, and said his son is considering not being a Christian. His kid's in high school, and like, would I talk with him? And I did, and I checked back a couple days ago. He said he's doing much better. He's been watching the videos online. So, but we have to be more proactive as the church. And so, with regards to let's do the science one first. What would you say to a parent who's struggling with their child in remaining in the faith because of perceived scientific discrepancies between the Bible and whatever they're taught in school?
Well, I want to know a couple things. I want to know if that's the explanation the kid is giving, or if that's really at the heart of this kid's disengagement. And oftentimes kids don't know. There's a proverb that talks about, a man or a person's purposes are deep and someone of wisdom draws it out. So I want to know in conversation with this kid, is this really the issue of science? It might be. There might be something else going on. And through conversations and questions, I want to try to surface what that is. Now, if it really is the science issue, then I'm going to find out what's the kid's issue? Is it that, guy, if evolution happened, then creation is false? Is that the issue? Is it the age of the earth? Is it just this larger perception that Christians are anti-science? Like, what's at the root of that belief system? And then how do I counter it? So if somebody was saying, for example, I just learned evolution in school and therefore Christianity is false, I'm saying, okay, let's bring another perspective in here and first define what we even mean by evolution.
Right.
That's the first question. And then second, I'm going to bring in some really smart scientists who raise another perspective that's often left out of this discussion. There are very good, smart reasons to question some of this evolutionary narrative that's being pushed on students. That's one way I'm going to go. And then second, I'm going to say, but even with that, with my young person, there's actually Christians who are very creatively and thoughtfully trying to ask, is an evolutionary perspective, depending on what you mean by evolution, consistent with a broader Christian worldview? And if so, how? Now, I don't adopt an evolutionary perspective, but in some ways, I just want to put as minimal barriers between this young person and the gospel as possible. I think sometimes in the church, we've said, you got to hold this view on the age of the earth, you got to interpret Genesis this way, or the entire edifice comes crashing down. I think that's just not wise at all. So yes, if Jesus rose from the grave and some kind of evolution happened, Christianity is true. That should be the heart of our faith. So I'm not going to freak out with this kid. I'm going to try to get to the root of it. I'm going to walk through different options and approaches and say, this issue is a little more complex than you realize, but you don't have to be threatened by your faith because of science. In fact, the scientific revolution was motivated by people who were theists and largely Christians who applied their worldview to the natural world.
Absolutely. Sorry, people are. So you know what? Let me just do this now, because since you're here, because people are asking about resources, and it's hard for me to type all of them right now as you are talking. So I'm going to tell a story at the end. So most people are aware of Jim Warner Wallace, another of my trainers. He's done cold case Christianity for adults and for kids. And I went through it with my daughter when she was 8. So to give you a baseline of what age level, I've written a book called Blueprint for Bible Basics, but this is actually, about the year before I came to CIA. It's called Blueprint for Bible Basics. It's available on my website. It's not purely apologetic, but it does give the foundations and the basics. It has study guide in it. It's more for teens. Sean, what else? Well, let me say this. So for parents, Natasha Crane has done some amazing things. I trained with her there as well, and she has 2 or 3 books. I can't remember now. And then what resources have you done, and would you be able to recommend?
I would affirm all of those that you mentioned. Great resources. I think the one that you did, that's outstanding. That's good to know. Natasha J. Warner Wallace's resources are excellent. A couple others. Lee Strobel does have the Case for Christ for teens and the Case for Christ for kids, Case for Creator, Case for Faith. These are great books to just read with a kid and discuss these topics together. My dad and I did one called Jesus is Alive. It's on the resurrection. These are just short, take you 5 or 10 minutes. How do we know the tomb was empty? How do we know Jesus was really God? Is there proof for heaven? And just ways to talk with your kids about these. But those 4 or 5 you mentioned are some of the best. I would highly recommend.
Yeah, and I think it's important for parents, youth pastors, whoever. The thing I love about Natasha's, I was actually going to speak, or I spoke at the National Children's Pastors Conference a few years ago.
Great.
And so, but I was talking in a workshop to parents, mainly parents and youth pastors. But when I say youth pastors, it's like, when I say youth pastor, usually I'm thinking high school, but these were whatever the one below that is. So I used some of the stuff in Natasha's mainly to show how to have conversation starters. Because what she did, especially with her first book, it's I think it's called 40 Conversations Every Parent Should Have with Their Kids. So it's not just telling you the information, but it tells you how to have how to have the conversation with your young person on their level and in a non-confrontational way. And, you know, it opens up their mind. Now, here's what I'll also say about Jim's. Before we read the book, because I was going to do it, maybe she was 7, and it was just she was just not quite there yet. But if you go to coldcasechristianityforkids.com, I think it's .com, there's 10 videos. You can watch them for free. So we had watched all of those videos at least 2 or 3 times prior to even reading the book. And anybody can do this. The videos are like 5 minutes long, and it's not really going into like the cosmological argument and stuff like that, but it's really teaching our young people how to think and how to assess evidence. So we would, there was like a spot on the couch, and I said, her name's Michaela. I was like, so Michaela, there's this spot. I could just blame you or your sister, or I could do what? And we were talking about evidence. And we're like, well, we could look for evidence. I was like, well, there's no video cameras. What? So just getting her to think of, don't just assume you know or assume someone else knows just because they said it. Like, what is the evidence pointing you towards? And like I said, she was 7. So we can get our kids thinking this way so that even when they get to school and the teacher's talking about evolution or this or that, I asked her one time, they were doing I don't know what they were doing, but it was a chicken and egg. Oh no, I was making a video and she saw me, and I had like the chicken and egg thing because it was from a talk I gave. And then they were talking in class, and she had the opportunity because, you know, which came first, chicken or egg? Well, I was like, well, if the egg came first, where did it come from? Now, if we believe in creation, it's a very easy question to answer. And so she kind of said that in her class, and it was a good moment for her to see, no, this makes logical sense. It's only confusing if you don't believe in a creator. So just little stuff like that is good for our young people to begin thinking. One of her classmates in one of her classes last week or a few weeks ago said something about some people believe in science and some people believe in God. And she said she was able to say, no, you don't have to choose. So just giving our kids little nuggets, and so they feel at least confident and valid, not in pushing back or being mean in class, because we shouldn't do that either, but at least letting people know there's another perspective. I had an issue almost because there was a parent, a private parent Facebook group for the school. Somebody said something, and they just assumed everyone agreed. And it was basically about how only idiots believe in religion. And he didn't say it that harshly, but it was pretty much like that. And I was like, I want to respond. My wife told me not to. But I did direct message this individual and say, look, I can show you some evidence. If you're open to having a conversation, I'm open to it. But I really wanted to protect my kids, but I also wanted to make him very aware. Everyone here does not share your point of view, and you're being disrespectful in thinking that you're being tolerant. Once again, we come back to the issue of the day, right?
Sure.
So with that being said, let's deal with the more thorny issue. S, the other S, sex. I know you've done a lot of research, written many books on navigating this biblical sexual ethic that we kind of outlined already in our current world. This is all, it seems like every day there's something on this issue in some way, shape, or form. In doing that lesson in Romans, somebody said it was their favorite lesson, but I think the reason, not because of me, but they finally felt that they were able now to have a way to have a conversation where they didn't feel like they were bashing up homosexual or somebody in that lifestyle. What would you say to a parent or pastor trying to navigate these topics with someone biblically?
Well, the first thing is we have to teach young people not just here's what we're against, but what we're for. That's really, really important. So the way I arranged my recent book is the whole first third of it is stripping away faulty ideas people have about freedom, faulty ideas about love. It's called Chasing Love. It's for students, really high school age students, although junior high and college would benefit from it. That's the target market. And the whole first third is assuming that our kids have adopted a real secular view of love and freedom and filter biblical teaching through that. Okay. The middle, then it's like, okay, what is a biblical view of sex? What's a biblical view of singleness? What's a biblical view of marriage? And then at the end, okay, let's talk about how ways that people see these issues differently. Let's talk about pornography. Let's talk about cohabitation, divorce, LGBTQ conversation. So we don't want to jump with our kids and just say, oh, here's how you talk to somebody who is Christian or not, who defines himself as gay. Let's talk about first what it means to be human. Let's talk about first God's design for sexuality. Let's talk about what it actually means to love people. Then we have more space and understanding how to actually do this. Yeah. And that's something we don't do well. I was at a conference with my dad. This is maybe a couple months before the whole COVID quarantine craziness. And we were teaching all day Friday, all day Saturday. And a teenager came up to me and he goes, thanks for your talk on pornography. I'd been told my whole life it was wrong, but nobody told me why. We often don't give the why behind it, which is where our kids get convictions and the motivation to do the right thing. So tactically, I would just say, let's teach our kids how to build relationships with people who see the world differently. Yeah. A friend of mine, is an evangelist, and his daughter is in relationship with a young man in high school who's gay. He's not a Christian. And they just honestly build a relationship together. They'll study, they'll watch movies, they'll just hang out. And because this guy's an evangelist, he asks the young man when he's over in time, he goes, okay, so when are you going to believe in Jesus? He's just like straight to the point. He goes, well, I'm not a Christian, but if I were going to, it would be because of someone like your daughter who's just befriended me and cares about me and doesn't feel the need to tell me, fix this, believe that. We talk about those things, but it doesn't feel forced. It feels genuine. Right. That's what I want my kids to be able to do, to listen, to build relationships, to love people who see the world differently. And one tool to be able to do that is to know what we believe and why we believe it. It makes us less threatened when people bring in challenging ideas.
That's really good. I love how you said that a lot of things you said, we have to know first what we believe. And I do see, I'm sure you see a lot of Christians, they know what to say and that's all they do. And they may not even themselves necessarily know why, but since it's not a struggle for them, they have no problem saying it to someone else because that's not a thing they have to battle. And so I remember, I think it was in Bobby's book, Bobby Conway, in the Fifth Gospel. And he talks about, he was pastor at a church, and there was this gay couple and he, as a pastor, he befriended them. I think he had him at his house for dinner and grew a relationship. And lo and behold, their perspective, their lifestyle actually ended up changing. But I've heard so many people, especially from Islam, talk about it was just somebody that kept loving me, even though they didn't agree, even though they pushed back and we pushed back on each other. That's how Abdul Murray came to faith, I believe, that some Christian just kept showing them that I'm still willing to be in a relationship, to love you biblically, even though I disagree, and that love is hard to ignore. This is why Jesus said, they shall know you by your love. And sometimes, we got to be honest. As a group, we're not always the most loving, some of us, and we got to work on that. We're all fallen, so we all got to work on that. But I think what you said is the approach we need to take. So hopefully that helps somebody if you're struggling to have these conversations. Let's talk about Gen Z. And I know you have done a lot of work and research on this. First, is Gen Z, I was doing some research. I think it's like 97 to 2015. Is that the right range for?
So demographers will judge it a little bit differently. Some start as early as 95. Some I've seen like 2005. But basically, it's those like 10 to 25 right now. That's essentially who would be a Gen Zer. So upper elementary towards those just going into the workforce is this new generation.
Okay. And so they're clearly different, as is every generation. And I guess there's a couple of questions. Do we need a different strategy, in your opinion, to reach them as opposed to our generation? Obviously, they've grown up. They know what cell phones are from the beginning. I remember when I got my first cell phone. I remember, it sounds like I'm old, but I'm really not that old. But I remember in high school when they were introducing the internet as this is like the way of the future. And we were like, okay, cool. But it wasn't that big a deal. I mean, at first. And so obviously these are digital natives, right? They know that world now. They're used to getting information from the internet, and they're used to getting it quickly. And in some ways this is good, but I also think Google has made everybody dumber because we don't have to remember anything or go to the library or, do all the stuff that we did growing up. And so if there was an information age, this is almost like the disinformation age. I don't know if that's a term or not, but there's so much misinformation. So asking a young person to sift through with the limited knowledge they already have is really unfair, but there's nothing we can do about it. So what tips could you give us for how to engage Gen Z and how to help them navigate this world of misinformation?
Well, the initial way you phrased the question, I like, you said, do we need a new strategy or do we keep it the same? And the answer is yes, because there's some things that need to change and some things that remain the same. Okay. So when we talk about a new generation, it's tempting to think there's this entirely new species. They see the world differently, different language, and other them in a sense. But the reality is anybody watching this, we have far more in common with this generation than we do differences. Our common humanity, our desire for love, our desire for purpose, these things are so much bigger and bind us together. And that's important because our culture basically says you're a product of your sex, where you're from, your race, all these different categories we break down and put people into these boxes, and we miss how much we share in common. So we have to approach this generation by saying we have much more in common and be positive in the way we see them and interact with them. That's my first encouragement. Now, I do think the way you said it is right, that a smartphone is the key to everything with this generation. It shapes how they build relationships, and it shapes how they see the world. So it affects them intellectually, and it affects them relationally. So when it comes to, say, a smartphone, we have to train kids how to navigate faulty ideas, recognize truth. We have to help them navigate how lies are coming through social media. Lies are coming through Netflix, and to have a biblical worldview to resist these faulty ideas. That is step number one. Number two is, okay, let's help a generation navigate relationships in a healthy fashion. So how do we have boundaries? Interestingly enough, J. Warner Wallace and I wrote the book on Gen Z. Two studies that fascinated me is I remember documenting two about this generation saying, yeah, we wish adults will put in healthy boundaries for us on technology, which surprised me. And then the latest volume 2 Gen Z study from Barna, see if I can get this right, 60% of young people, Gen Zers, think this was 13 to 17-year-old, said their generation uses too much technology, and 53% feel bad about it. So
Wow.
there is a self-awareness that it affects relationships and it should be better. So the big picture is, let's think through how technology shapes the way they process truth, they engage ideas, and then second, how they form relationships. Because
Yeah.
both of those truths, Jesus came in grace and he came in truth. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, and I only gave you the gospel, but my very own life. That's a formula we've always had: grace and truth, relationships and truth. But how we live that out today in a digitally native generation is where we have to be intentional and thoughtful and creative.
Man, that's really good. I think back to basics, right? Sometimes we get too smart for our own good, maybe, and try to reinvent the wheel every time. But as you said, referring back to that passage from Paul, it's the same thing still works. Grace and truth and love have to coexist. That's the other thing I always want to emphasize.
Amen.
Trying to get these comments in here. They're talking about now. Very true. Very true. Yeah, there was a meme, and it said in the 1980s, the expert was Dr. So and so. In the 90s, it was, I don't know, your teacher in school. In the 2000s, it's Jill on Facebook. It's kind of the unfortunate world we live in now. But there is hope, because the Bible's still true. The same way that the disciples were able to do it, the same thing we can do it. We just have to utilize the technology, but we can't sacrifice that grace and that love. So with that, I find myself talking a lot about this kind of slippery slope of removing the objective moral foundation, and kind of that's where your work has come in a lot, as far as, okay, now let me rebuild or reaffirm that objective moral foundation, especially as it pertains to sex and morality and marriage and all these other things. Some things are true, some things are not true. That's not my opinion. That's not even a theological point. That's just the nature of truth. So I believe there's good reason to believe that objective moral foundation is rooted in God and in his nature. And so it's subtle. So when I say something like that, or when something like that is said, some people can think you're blowing it out of proportion. But then you look up, when we look up in 20 years, they'll see that we weren't blowing it out of proportion. And I don't want to say it's too late, but stuff gets so entrenched and it's hard to untangle that. I think there was a study not even a study, a report. It was correct me. Do you remember? There was 2 Harvard, I want to say, individuals that wrote about, this is how you get LGBT to be mainstream. And it was kind of like this 3-step process of desensitization, and first you got to get something on TV. You know what I'm talking about?
There was a book written in the I can't remember if it was late 80s or early 90s, called After the Ball. And it was a strategy to transform cultural views of homosexuality, and it worked. It was effective. And some of the strategy in there, like, is if anybody is not affirming, compare them to Nazis. I'm like, oh, that's an effective strategy. Instead of having LGBTQ angry and showing some of the parades, let's show them as normal and funny, and they get the jokes. Let's mainstream this. And it was an effective, you could say, marketing campaign, for lack of a better term, and it worked.
Yeah. So this is not happenstance, you all. This is kind of, it was thought out, and I don't say by everybody, but at least somebody was thinking this out, how this could come to where it is and where it might be going. So anyway, that it's been 20 years since that, and here where we are. And so 20 years from here, there's a slippery slope that we're on, and maybe it's not so slippery anymore. It's pretty obvious. So let me ask, how would you help young apologists and Christians in general kind of poke holes in the idea of how some ground their moral standard, which can lead to conversations about how God best explains the existence of moral values and moral duties. And this can even become evangelistic, but how would you help somebody who's kind of trying to figure out how to voice this, as maybe they're young in apologetics, young in Christianity? What are some kind of entry points for them to kind of sound the alarm without making it sound like they're sounding the alarm?
Well, there's a couple ways to do this. Number one is people can use social media very creatively to engage the culture and get people to think. So I did it's been a few months, kind of when shortly after the protests, I let it settle a little bit, is I said, there's a lot of people who are condemning racist actions who don't even believe in God. I'm not sure how you can even say racism is wrong if humans aren't made in God's image and there's no objective moral standard. So all of you standing up condemning racism, which you should do, are actually affirming that humans have value and there's an objective moral standard, which only makes sense if there's a God. And I mean, people got all in a tizzy and were debating and went back and forth. That was like lighting the fires, but it was a way of taking a contemporary issue and saying, let's go a little deeper. And I realized you got to be sensitive and careful in the timing when this is done. I didn't do this like the day after the George Floyd protest. Like that just wouldn't be a wise, careful time. But you let it sit. People are talking about it and you go, hey, here's something maybe you didn't think about, and push it out there. So I like to use cultural ideas that people are talking about to make a deeper point. That's one thing that I'll bring in conversation. I found the best way is just to ask questions. Just ask people questions. And that's what Jesus did. He told stories and he asked questions. Why? Questions remove the burden of proof to somebody else. It's not us preaching, so walls don't come up the same. And it just causes somebody typically to think. So a well-placed, thoughtful question. I've done a few. I haven't released them on social media yet. Of just asking some questions really quick to the point to leave a thought in somebody's mind that maybe they'll reflect back on later. So use cultural moments, ask pointed questions is a better way to get somebody to think rather than to just get in debate back and forth, which often turns south and doesn't benefit anybody when it's all said and done.
Yeah, no, you're very on the nose on that one. Asking questions, it lowers the tone of the conversation as well. And there's a book Vince Vitale of RZIM told me about, which I still haven't gotten, even though I talk about it all the time. It's the 307 questions Jesus asked and the 3 questions that he answered. Just thinking about the one who literally was the truth, had the answer to everything, but chose as his primary method of engagement to ask questions, not answer questions. And I always think about that. And I think, especially in apologetics, it can get so heady sometimes that you're like, oh, I know the answer and let me hit it. And we go straight there sometimes. And we haven't, as you said prior, like a few questions ago with that young person, you're asking questions to get to the root, because kind of the worst part is to answer a question that they didn't ask, or to answer a question you think they asked, but that was really a smokescreen question anyway. When we're doing Q&A, a lot of times the initial question is not the question, is just the one that they feel they can win with. But then you start to go a little layers deeper and, so the real issue is this. So let me deal with this. And even if, after I get off the stage, come see me at the booth type of thing. Let's not even make this public, because then it's a genuine conversation. It's not a sparring match, so to speak. And so sometimes the conversations get nasty because people are talking over each other or at each other instead of with each other. So let me ask one more question. I sometimes find myself kind of beating my head against the wall, trying to get some churches and pastors to understand the urgency, the need for apologetics now. So, okay, let me tell this story. So I started teaching my youngest, like I said, apologetics when she was maybe 7. And then when she was ready, we went through the Cold Case for Kids book. We did all the worksheets. We printed them all out. She filled everything in. This is after going through the videos 2 or 3 times. And at the end, I didn't like jump straight to, okay, you want to get saved? So I made her explain to me all chapter by chapter. Okay, so explain. So what does this mean about the creation of you? Is based on these evidences, and she had everything written down. And it's like, okay, so there's good. Does it make more sense that something came from nothing or something came from someone? Going through
Good.
to the evidence for the resurrection, and the way that Jim does it with the story of the skateboard, and obviously he's a great artist as well. So anyway, we go through all these and make her kind of reiterate to me, what is it you actually understand? Because I don't want to give her, like, I could give her all the answers, but I need her to tell me what she knows. Then at the end of all that, I said, well, now we're at a point where you have a choice. You don't have to make this choice today. But based on everything you now know from an evidential point of view, you have to decide, do you want this God, this Jesus, to be Lord of your life? Or is that something that you just don't think we're going towards, or don't think the evidence goes towards? And then I left it. And then maybe an hour later, she comes, she's like, and I texted Jim, I was like, she decided to go from belief that to belief in.
Cool.
And so I went upstairs, me, my wife, we're kind of there together, and I led her through the prayer. And so she made a decision to get saved. And so for whoever asked about the youth books, please, like, these resources exist. Go get them, use them, recommend them to other parents, other youth ministries, because we can't wait. Like, I deal mostly with teens, and a lot of time they're so entrenched in whatever they've thought. It's hard for me to unravel everything at that point, especially if they didn't grow up in a Christian home, or even if they did. But so I say that to preface this. I know the value, you know the value. And granted, every parent's not going to necessarily be equipped to do all of that. And that's fine. That's why the resources exist. So my question to you is, what does the church, what do youth pastors need to know to spark the urgency of the moment, with regards to giving our young people the tools they need in order to be able to not just engage their friends, but understand life properly?
Well, here's 2 things they can do. Number 1 is take TikTok videos, take Snapchat videos, so you screenshot it, take YouTube videos, show them to parents and students of the other side, and say, these are the ideas coming through. Are you ready to answer this?
Wow.
That's one practical thing. Second, bring students who have left the ministry, gone into the university, who can talk about, yeah, I was in class, my professor said, we all know the Bible is full of contradictions. I was in class, my professor said, we know creationism is nonsense and evolution explains everything, or whatever it is. You bring those students back so it communicates to the younger students, hey, you're going to be here very soon, and these are the kinds of challenges that are coming. So those are 2 practical things I found that work.
Oh, that's great. And so would you just doing that to other youth, or would you recommend even reaching out to pastors and saying, hey, you know,
so other pastors is a little tricky, because they've got a million people reaching out to them saying, solve this problem. If you care about a local pastor, I would go just have coffee, spend time, build a relationship with them, and just let them know, hey, here's one area of ministry my church has done. We've seen fruit with it. I've been able to counsel this way and teach. If that's ever something that helps you, let me know, and I will jump in and help you and be happy to give you resources. I would do that with pastors in that fashion more so, because I know pastors are told, hey, help with this cause, help with that cause. Everybody wants a pastor's ear. And if you're a pastor, build a relationship with them. Hey, what's working in your church? What have you done well? Tell me what can help you. Hey, do you mind if I share these something that's worked for me? As I've been doing apologetics, let me tell you a couple things that have really transformed my church. If it's something you think about doing, I would love to help you. And if the pastor says no, then you don't want to force a square peg into a round hole. If he says yes and it sparks interest, then you're ready to help. And it might be that you throw this out there, and then a year or 2 later, the pastor's own kid is like, I don't believe my faith. He goes, man, I got to call Alex. That's what spurs it. So that's how I would approach it with pastors.
That's great advice. And I think that really That's very practical and very honest. And actually, that is how that pastor reached out to me.
Good.
It was from a
Good.
couple years ago, and I didn't connect with him on a periodic basis or anything like that. It just, when the crisis hits, when you get sick, you go to the doctor, even if you don't go regularly, right? And so we want to be available, even if you're not a full-time apologist. Just if you feel that you can help, if you feel God's called you to help in this way, and I'm just talking to everybody watching, just be available and be prepared to be used, because ultimately it's not about us or our personal ministries or anything like that. It's about advancing the kingdom of God. And so whatever way God gives each of us to do that, so much the better.
Amen.
Amen. And so I really appreciate you joining. Let me see if there's any other questions in here. All right. All right. Well, if I don't see any other questions for Sean, we're going to let him get out of here. I know he's really busy. Sean, I truly appreciate you joining me today. And yeah, until next time, you all stay tuned for all the other things that we have coming out, and whatever way we can be of a blessing to you or an aid to you or your ministry or your household. That's what we seek to do. All right. Peace.